Due Process, for the second consecutive year, recipient of Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards for Outstanding Talk Show Series and Outstanding Public Affairs Series.
The death penalty. Is this punishment alive or dead in New Jersey? We'll find out next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.
Should death ever be the punishment for criminal conduct? I'm Raymond Brown, and today we'll explore whether New Jersey has answered this question. 16 years ago, death penalty proponents thought they had won a significant battle when New Jersey adopted a death penalty. However, despite numerous death penalty convictions in New Jersey, no one has been executed. Those who support the death penalty are frustrated. Their adversaries accuse them of being in an unseemly rush to impose the ultimate penalty. This special Due Process report helps sort out the controversy.
My children were abused by him.
Appeals by defendant family members during the penalty phase of a capital murder trial are commonplace. They raise mitigating factors intended to sway the jury away from a death sentence.
The pain she suffered at the hands of Jamie Barone on that fateful day.
But it wasn't until just 1996 that victim impact statements could be made to the court, and they were strictly controlled.
It wasn't really fair where a victim statement has all types of procedural restrictions in terms of the manner that it's to be presented, unemotional, dry run, while a defendant had free rein in making this emotional pitch to the jury.
Boris Moshula is First Assistant Prosecutor, Passaic County. Experienced with the death penalty, he recently served as a member of the Governor's Study Commission on the implementation of the death penalty.
Guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
It has been more than 16 years since New Jersey's death penalty was adopted. During that time, no executions have taken place.
It's really hard to gauge how effective the law is in terms of deterrence and other factors when we've had a law that hasn't been implemented.
I believe in capital punishment. You commit the crime, you should be able to do the time.
If there are people on death row, I say use it.
The public supports the death penalty and doesn't understand how it has taken this long for New Jersey to get the job done. Richard Pompelio's son Tony was murdered in 1989. An attorney, he has since founded the New Jersey Crime Victims Law Center.
So what we've been able to do is give the victim a presence in the court and the justice system, a voice, a face.
But his experience with the system has convinced him that the death penalty is unworkable.
I've been involved with too many victims where the death penalty was sought. They go through it, there's a death penalty conviction. 4 or 5 years down the road, it's reversed. This family is still in that. And the end result is there's a feeling of loss at the end.
Death penalty proponents see a system bogged down in endless procedural processes. The Study Commission held hearings in '97 and '98 looking for some answers. The final report was submitted in August last year.
I think the most important aspects were those that dealt with eliminating some of the steps of review. Not because we want to eliminate all safeguards, but the feeling was that too many safeguards were in the process in terms of duplication.
And they won't kill him.
Today, capital cases must navigate their way through an appeals process which includes a proportionality review. The Study Commission has recommended the elimination of this step, which can add 18 months to the case's journey.
It's a second stage in the appellate process, which compares a death sentence to other death sentence cases in New Jersey. And the feeling was that this was a statistical process, a very complex system of review that ultimately didn't really tell us anything reliable about how death sentences work in New Jersey.
Let's say you had 99 consecutive convenience store robberies that ended in life verdicts, either because of a guilty plea or because that's what the jury did. You start to see an evolving consensus that that's society's belief, that even though that's a horrible murder and the person should get life without parole, they shouldn't be executed for that. If in the 100th case, however, the person does get the death penalty, we feel that there's something wrong about that. It's just disproportionate.
The proportionality review is meant as a control for that kind of skewed sentence. The process involves conducting a comprehensive analysis of similar cases and their resulting sentences.
I think it's a very important part of the process. I think it's uniquely important in New Jersey, where we don't have any other safeguards against that sort of disproportionality, and we argue that it's not only constitutionally required, but that it's bad public policy to get rid of it.
Larry Lusberg is a criminal defense attorney and an outspoken opponent of the death penalty. While he sympathizes with victims, he feels death penalty decisions should not be emotional reactions.
I try to step back and I try to say, but is that good public policy? Is it good law? And that's a different question. It doesn't mean that the emotions are invalid.
Proportionality review was designed in part to prevent biased results based on race.
This issue has been raised continuously by the Public Defender's Office in terms of appeals of death sentence cases, and even the court's own expert came to the conclusion that there simply wasn't enough there to indicate any type of racial effect.
But Lusberg is unconvinced.
Deeply and subconsciously racist. I don't think juries set out to do the wrong thing, but the statistics are overwhelming that, in fact, when you control for all relevant variables, it turns out that the African-American defendant is far more likely to receive a death penalty from a jury in New Jersey than is the white defendant.
Trying to establish a workable framework for the ultimate punishment is the reason for the length of time it's taken to clear the way towards New Jersey's first execution.
As a society, we must, absolutely must insist that death penalty be rational, that it not be arbitrary. And there never will be that consistency because each case really is unique.
As the facts of each case are unique, so are the varying abilities of defense attorneys and judicial experience. Prosecutors base decisions on bringing death penalty cases upon many different factors, not the least of which is the time and expense involved with trying death penalty cases. But the public will is unmistakable, and so prosecutors like Boris Moshula soldier on.
It's a frustrating process. It's a very time-consuming and, frankly, an emotionally draining process. No one will take any pleasure in putting a defendant ultimately to death, but as prosecutors, we have an oath to follow, and that is to uphold the law and the Constitution of this state, and that law currently includes a death penalty law.
There were 334 murders in New Jersey in 1997. About 30% of those involved death penalty aggravating factors. Yet the vast majority were not selected to be prosecuted as death penalty cases. Boris Moshula expects that it will still be many years before the Commission's streamlining recommendations are adopted.
These won't take effect until they actually move through the legislature and are enacted, and that's really anybody's guess.
Meanwhile, there are currently 14 inmates on death row. Both Lusberg and Moshula don't anticipate an execution anytime soon, whether the study is implemented or not. But one of the recommendations allows for victims' families to witness the fatal injection.
The only other time I suspect that we would see him is if the death sentence is carried out and we're allowed to watch.
So the battle rages on, with those who favor the death penalty saying that the failure to execute anyone undermines respect for law, and their opponents arguing that proportionality review is one of several guarantees that the ultimate penalty will not be unfairly imposed. When we come back, we'll hear from several experts in an effort to unravel this knotty question.
There's a perception among the general public, I think, among many people, that when a homicide occurs, the victim's family in a capital murder case and the friends and other relatives are strictly, in a sense, out for vengeance, the eye for the eye type of thing. It's been my experience that in talking to these survivors of murder victims, which I, of course, myself are one, that it is not really true true. What is true is the fact that they feel that they want justice. And there is a big, big difference between wanting justice and wanting vengeance. And the difference is this, that wanting vengeance, it is the eye for an eye. But with justice, what it means is that the penalty for this crime is death. And that is what they feel is justice to them. The same as if a robbery suspect is convicted of robbing your house and the penalty is 2 years. The victim wants him to get 2 years. That's justice because he robbed the house. The same in a capital murder case. They want justice, and the justice is the death penalty. It is not vengeance the way the perception is out there among the general public. And I think the only way you can really realize that, God forbid, is when you become a survivor of a murder victim.
Will there be executions in New Jersey's future? Those who favor the death penalty are critical of the slow pace of trials and appeals in death cases. Their opponents say we should be more careful and more deliberate in capital cases than in any others. The bottom line is that in 16 years, New Jersey has executed no one, and there's no certainty as to when the state will ultimately put someone to death. To explain why, we're joined by former Congressman Dick Zimmer, chair of the Governor's Committee to Study Implementation of the Death Penalty, Lee Solomon, Camden County prosecutor and former assemblyman who's always been outspoken on criminal justice issues, and David Runke from Newark, one of the most widely respected opponents of the death penalty in the country, both as a trial lawyer and as an abolitionist. Welcome to you all. Chairman Zimmer, let me start with you. Since this is the ultimate penalty that cannot be reversed, and since in the last several years we've seen reversals of death penalty convictions after long periods on death row in other states around the country, why is there so much emphasis on time and movement? Why is that an important policy consideration?
Justice delayed is justice denied. And in the case of New Jersey's death penalty, which has been on the books for now closer to 17 years, and where no execution is in sight, this failure to enforce the law that's on the books brings the entire criminal justice system into disrepute. It prolongs the suffering of the family members of the victims, and it is really it's an injustice in itself to what we believe in this state. Now, we have the death penalty on the books. Those who want it to take as long as possible are generally those who don't like the death penalty in the first place. And they get their second choice, which is the death penalty with no death. But I think that's the ultimate act of hypocrisy, and it's also very, very bad for the credibility of our criminal justice system.
David Runke, did the Commission overlook any concerns about justice in making its recommendations about reducing peremptory challenges and abandoning proportionality review and other things that it considered?
Well, I think the Commission is reacting to a frustration that's not based on really reality. The long delay in executing anybody in New Jersey, and just stick around, folks, it's going to happen, is attributable primarily to the fact that our New Jersey Supreme Court was fine-tuning this law for many years and reversed many of the early death sentences. That has stopped. The New Jersey Supreme Court has not reversed a death sentence in several years. Reversals are becoming increasingly rare, and the idea of federal courts overturning death sentences is becoming more and more of a rare phenomena. It's going to happen.
Lee Solomon, is it your view, if David Runke is correct, that essentially there was an early period where the court really took a hard look at the statutes and subsequently is really fine-tuning, and that we all know there are relatively few federal overturnings, federal reversals of state death convictions? Why is there a concern that justice isn't being done if what's happening is just using the appellate process to make sure we don't make a mistake?
I think certainly in part what David says is true. Unfortunately, recently in our own county, we had a matter remanded for a retrial on the imposition of the death penalty in the case of an individual who murdered, in cold blood, murdered 2 law enforcement officers. So the Supreme Court is still dealing with the issue, is still, while not reversing the sentence per se, has still prolonged the suffering of the victims and the family. And they've also said very clearly that they are not giving up proportionality review. In the Lofton case, which is the case that was recently decided that upheld a death sentence, they clearly said that while they do not find that it's being imposed disproportionately, they are not giving up that issue. They are going to continue the special master. And I would say we haven't seen the last of this issue, nor have we seen the last of the delays.
For some of our viewers, this is their first exposure to this concept called proportionality. And while much of the argument has been about race, there's an overall concern that like people be executed and not unlike people. That is, that there be a fairness in the way the penalty is used. Do you disagree with the principle of proportionality?
I think there was always a due process argument in the event that any sentence is imposed disproportionately. Is it necessary to have that particular type of structure in our death penalty statute? Probably not. But one of the things that we recognize as prosecutors is that the Supreme Court has decided whether or not the legislature acts on the issue, they are going to retain that. I think it is fundamentally a due process issue. The one thing I would like to see happen in the case of proportionality is not simply to consider the individual defendant, but consider the individual victim. Because race is frequently an issue in looking at the victim and the victims, and they are disproportionately people of color. They are disproportionately victimized, and I think that in failing to take the victim's perspective in some of these things, we may apply proportionality disproportionately.
But in principle, you're not opposed to the concept of proportionality.
It is a due process issue, and our job is to serve justice, and we want to see every penalty imposed justly.
Chairman Zimmer, your committee recommended that maybe instead of proportionality review, some attempt at guidelines from the AG's office in terms of how the initial charging decision is made. Do you think that's a substitute for proportionality review by the court?
I think it's wrong to relieve from the death penalty somebody who has been found to be guilty and who has been found unanimously to be worthy of the death penalty by a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. David Ronke said each case is unique. To let that person go free because somebody else, somewhere else, was treated differently, I think is wrong. If there is an arbitrary decision, if there is any kind of bias, including racial bias in the system, that's unconstitutional in and of itself. But there's no reason to have a 1.5-year process to go through this statistical mumbo-jumbo to try to figure out whether this unique crime and this unique defendant are being treated worse or better than somebody else. The Constitution, the federal and state constitutions protect people from invidious discrimination. There's no reason to have 3 shots guaranteed at this Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, plus the extra appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court. We believe that to expedite the process in a reasonable way, we can eliminate proportionality review as a separate process. The Lofton decision that we referred to took 2 years for the state Supreme Court to decide after they heard oral arguments. And what they concluded essentially is they couldn't make head or tail of the data, of the statistics that they were presented over the years.
Let me bring Dave. Chairman Zimmer has suggested that because you say each case is different, that you've abandoned your support for proportionality review. Is that true?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. First of all, no one goes free if a death sentence is vacated. People spend the rest of their lives in prison. On a second issue, it's a question of do we want a fair death penalty or don't we want a fair death penalty? And if it's your policy position that people who commit similar crimes from similar backgrounds with similar victims under similar circumstances, that it doesn't matter that 50 of those people do not receive a death penalty, but one does, and it's okay to execute that one person, well, then that's a policy decision. But it's a wrong policy decision from my perspective.
What about the question of race? Lee Solomon has suggested that race of victims should also be taken into account in the context of proportionality review. Do you have feelings about that either way?
Race of victim, I mean, the death penalty and race have always marched hand in hand. 80% of the executions that have taken place in this country since Furman versus Georgia was overturned have taken place in the South. The reason the New Jersey Supreme Court took 2 years in Lofton to reach its decision is that there is that suggestion, and no one can gainsay it, that race plays a role in how juries interpret and impose sentences of death. The answer is there isn't enough cases yet to make that finding, but it's there, and I predict it's going to be found once the numbers are high enough. It's always been found, everywhere it's been looked at.
Is it troublesome, Lee, that throughout the years there has been a continuous argument that statistically, whether the race of the victim or the race of the defendant is looked at, race and then class also play a role in how this penalty is imposed? Does that in the gut leave some problem with a penalty, even one that you might otherwise find acceptable?
It is troublesome if that is in fact the case. If in fact it is being imposed because of the race or socioeconomic strata of the perpetrator, that's a problem. And that's really what needs to be looked at. Just because an individual may be a person of color, may be a person without economic means, but in fact commits a murder, doesn't necessarily mean they should avoid the death penalty. If, however, that is the motivating factor behind the jury's decision, certainly that's a concern of any prosecutor. I think the key is that we have to make sure that it is imposed justly, fairly, and there are many, many hurdles that have to be overcome. There are many, many protections. The issue is whether there should be additional appeals, additional delays, and a denial of that justice, a delay in that justice, which seems to be inappropriate. Certainly the public thinks so, and the Supreme Court's even hinted that it may not be necessary.
Let me move past the question of proportionality and just look at the question of time. David, let me turn to you and put a question to you as a well-known opponent both of the death penalty as well as somebody who tries to avoid it for clients whenever you represent them, and that is that this commission has recommended a number of things in terms of the appellate process and even jury selection that might move things along. Is there validity to the argument of proponents that time is a factor that ultimately erodes the public's confidence in the justice system?
Well, in terms of the death penalty itself, as your introductory section properly pointed out, it's rare for prosecutors to even seek the death penalty. It's even rarer for jurors to impose it when they are given that option. We're talking about a minor subset of homicides, none of which carry a mandatory death sentence. I heard Jim O'Brien talk about, well, if a robbery calls for 2 years and the defendant doesn't get 2 years, that's not justice. Well, there aren't any mandatory death penalties either. Cutting down the number of peremptory challenges in jury selection is going to save a week and a half of jury selection, which is not a significant number at the end of the long death penalty process. So I don't see these as achieving the ends that are sought to be achieved.
There sometimes might... Go ahead, you were going to say something.
I would hardly call these most brutal of all murders a minor subset. Of all the 14 people on death row, I can't think of one that doesn't deserve to be there because of the vicious, brutal nature of the crime.
But I think one of the issues that's interesting is that you, for example, have been well known, as has Lee Solomon, and a number of people on the other side of the issue, in arguing about a criminal justice question that, while it's obviously important, affects a relatively small number of people in terms of defendants who go to trial in capital cases, and therefore the consumption of time overall is a relatively small percentage of court time. So the question is, what is the balance in there that makes you think it important?
If you are involved in jury selection over a period of several weeks, you shut down that criminal court for that period of time.
Why is that a bad thing?
The judges are not allowed to do the normal work of a criminal court, and especially in medium-sized and smaller counties, you shut down the ability to prosecute people who committed other serious crimes. That has become a deterrent to the enforcement of the death penalty. The death penalty has become its own deterrent rather than a deterrent to murder.
Lee Solomon, are there cases in which you would have sought the death penalty but for the fact that the Camden County Courthouse would be reduced to immobilization?
In all honesty, no, there haven't. Let me say to you, there are a couple things that Dave says that are in fact the case. They are sought in a very small number of cases. There are many other areas that we as prosecutors deal in much greater numbers that have a greater impact on the criminal justice system. And I don't disagree with his analysis of that. What I do disagree with is this. Every one of those cases is extremely high profile. Every one of those cases has a tremendous community impact, not just upon the victim, not just upon the defendant. Every one of those cases is known by most of the people in the state of New Jersey, and therefore the failure to carry out what is perceived to be a just sentence and what the Supreme Court has said is a just sentence erodes confidence overall in the criminal justice system. And when you do that, even though the number of cases may be small, when you've eroded confidence in the overall system, it has an impact on all the cases we handle. It has an impact on the concept of public safety and the perception of public safety, so that the ancillary detriment of not seeing to it that the punishment is carried out reasonably swiftly, taking into account all the rights of the defendant, does a disservice to our system of criminal justice far beyond the 14 cases we're talking about.
We're down to one-word answer time. When will we see the first execution, Chairman Zimmer?
Not in this century.
Dave Runke?
Well, not in this century, certainly, since
Actually, that's not much. That's only a few months. He tricked me. I fell asleep on that one. Well, that means I'm going to have to invite you all back at some point in the next century to talk about the process of the death penalty and what it means in New Jersey. But that's it for this edition of Due Process. I want to thank you all. We're going to ask you to join us next week when our docket will include another important look at law and social justice. Till then, for all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown.
You don't go looking in a book and find that there's a policy to be racist the way there was in Mississippi, let's say, back in the 50s and 60s. It doesn't even exist in Mississippi anymore. In New Jersey, there are these sort of deep-seated racial divisions. We have a very segregated state, and there's a lot of very disturbing evidence that there's in fact a great deal of racism in our state. I don't think juries set out to do the wrong thing, but the statistics are overwhelming that in fact, when you control for all relevant variables, if you can isolate two cases that are the same, one in which the exact same murder was committed by the exact same defendant and the only difference between the two of them is their race, it turns out that the African-American defendant is far more likely to receive a death penalty from a jury in New Jersey than is the white defendant.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.